Good morning, Professor Tootle. This is our 21st show, I think. And by the way, I'm making that up. It could be our 19th or 25th. I'm not sure. But thank you so much for having a conversation about LGBTQIA, and it goes on. It's fascinating for a guy like me to watch how much this has evolved in my lifetime. Um, and so before we begin, and I've got a couple big introductory questions, but before we do that, do you mind giving your brief bona fides about who you are? Some folks who are watching this in the future won't know you. So, Professor Tootle, who are you?
My name is Stephen Tootle. I teach history at College of Sequoias. What else do you want to know? PhD
Well,
in modern
there
American
you go.
history from Ohio University. Mostly studied political, intellectual history along with European intellectual history, Soviet history, and done a lot of writing on a lot of subjects.
Yeah, yeah, sure glad to have you as my. Neither of us are paid on this project. This is a citizenship pro bono effort for making America stronger. So thank you for that. You do have one thing in your bio or your resume about LGBTQIA. Do you mind
Oh,
explaining what that is?
yeah, I was the founder of the Log Cabin of Sequoias, the gay rights Republican club that encompassed the area between Bakersfield and Fresno. Log Cabin Republicans is the oldest uh, gay rights organization affiliated with a political party. It came from opposition to the Briggs Amendment here in California. When Ronald Reagan was the governor, there was a movement to ban homosexuals from being teachers. And Republicans founded this organization to oppose the Briggs Amendment, which Reagan did oppose, and the Briggs Amendment failed in California. And the organization stuck around. So, I was on the state board for the Log Cabin Republicans for many years. I only resigned when I was, became less involved with the regular party politics within the Republican Party. But I was pretty involved in, you might say, gay rights issues on the ground for a better part of a decade-ish.
Gotcha. And so you have some cultural expertise or political expertise, as well as your undergraduate, master's, and PhD in history. And I assume gay rights touches many aspects of history, correct?
Yes, but I mean, I guess I would emphasize, but it is not my area of historical expertise. But I am a historian on one hand, but I was engaged in this political activism on the other hand. So
Yeah, gotcha. Well, so I was shocked today, as I'm wont to do when I interview an expert in history, since I'm a layman. I go to the mighty Wikipedia to find all knowledge. Uh, and I was completely shocked at how much information in history there is about LGBTQ history, and a lot of it was tied with the history of slavery and the Black experience. That really surprised me, and maybe it was just a couple sites I looked at, but in big picture, can and I can also tell you why I'm interested in this topic. But in big picture, can you tell me, is this a story that's ended now? I mean, it was pretty nasty for the last couple of decades of my life. Animosity between political parties or campaigns, and boys, there've been revolutionary change from the Defense of Marriage Act and military service, and I mean, just go on and on. This has been a hot topic in our lives. Are we done? Is it complete? Or are we just beginning? Where are we?
well, I'd say that, like every issue of rights, it's never completed because we live in a pluralistic system, and because of that, we're constantly balancing rights against one another. And it's an important, maybe it's a good place to start a discussion like this, is to remind ourselves that none of our rights exists in a vacuum. There's this new concept that people think they need called intersectionality, that says that all forms of oppression are related. But I would just say we don't need some sort of new concept called intersectionality. We can just remember that our founding was based upon the idea of pluralism, which says that all rights or all of politics is about negotiating peacefully between the rights of individuals. And you don't need a new theory of governance in order to talk about these issues. The old ones work just fine. This is yet another issue that gets worked out as an individual, how you live your private life, and then how you interact with the rest of the world and what that means. And so because of that, these issues are never finished. And in particular, there's always a new frontier when it comes to every right that is discussed in the public sphere. So of course, this will never be finished. And it's important for us to understand that our system is based on the idea that perfection is never possible, and that these are struggles that will always go on.
Yeah, oh gosh, there's so much material to begin with. I guess I should add one more premise to it, and then see if you have another premise before I ask my first question. I am interested in this as a conservative because I don't want you as a friend, I guess if you ask and I'm willing to tell you, I don't mind telling you about my private life, maybe. But still, that's a voluntary friendship kind of thing, maybe even a contractual relationship. I guess I could tell an employer something, or a group of friends in an association. But I don't want government to know what I'm doing in my private life. I just don't think it's any of their business. And so that's the reason I'm kind of interested in this topic, because I feel like if I'm an ambassador for this right to control my own body and who I associate with and what I do with a consenting adult, as long as my wife approves, then it's none of your business, especially if you're government. So I look at this as a conservative angle, and I don't mean to bring us into politics already, but that's kind of my interest, is that I've come to conclude that my previous opinion as a young man was wrong, and my current opinion is more accurate, is the better way to conduct my life. That I want to control my life. I want you to control your life, and good. Let's live the American dream. That's my perspective. Can you give a kind of an overview or thought on your perspective on this topic?
Well, I remember I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I mean, my activism with the log cabin Republicans, and somebody asked if I was the only straight person in the on the state board, and I just replied like, no, it never came up, and I have no idea. That's the one place where nobody ever said, what are you into? It really had nothing to do with the work we were doing, so I didn't. I assumed that most of the people I was working with were some had, some had been previously discriminated against because of their sexuality for one reason or another. But it really, I think that was kind of the point, which is that it shouldn't matter what we're into sexually. You can look me up and find out that during those years I was married to a woman and had children and stuff like that, and so it wouldn't be that hard to find out that that I am a straight male. but I agree, it's really nobody's business what goes on in my private life, unless I choose to make those aspects of my life public, or bring them into something that becomes fair public debate. But I think it is useful, though, because of our age and our journeys, to really be honest about where we started and how we got where we are. Because just like in matters of faith and in politics, I'm unlike a lot of people in that I never had a revelation and I never had a rejection. I was my parents weren't interested in politics. I was always a conservative Republican. By the 8th grade, I was volunteering at the Central Committee. which was in 1988, and I never had you know, uh, I never had a moment where I had to reject. So in a way, all of my political ideas have come via evolving within that space, and thus I'm not a convert to anything new, but I would say I am somebody who has always just put their what they learn into a context. Um, so um, in that sense, I don't know where did you start? And I think we've got to the part where you said where you finished. I know
Yeah.
maybe I'm not supposed to
But,
interview you, but
well, I'm hesitant to go too far down this path, but just to honor your request that it's nice to know perspective. I will tell you that when I was a young man, conservative Republican, proud to vote for Reagan the first time, grew up in a Reagan household and reading the Constitution as a young man and heading to a conservative rural college in Colorado. I was anti-gay back in 1984 when I started college. And anti is kind of a weird. I wouldn't consider myself anti-gay. I think we were all kind of anti-gay, or most of us, or the culture was, and I did have a revelation or a change of heart. I was mean spirited. I said some cruel things to a gay friend of mine, really cruel things as a young man in college, and I regret that to this day. And I've apologized to him and had his partner over for dinner at our house, and I've been to his home. So I actually did. I just don't want to be a cruel, mean spirited man. I don't. And so I've made a very intentional decision not to be cruel, because it's none of my business. As a conservative, it's none of my business. Even if I don't understand it or like it or appreciate it, that's irrelevant. I just want to be a nice, kind, loving person. So I did have it. So I think we differ in that background. And I'm just trying to honor your question. I do have, let's get into the history if you don't mind, unless you have a compelling follow up. Okay, cool. So Professor, as I'm wont to do, I'm really proud of our country, and I want to kind of head to the very beginning. There seems like there's a lack of information for couple thousand years about gays and lesbians and transgender. It just doesn't seem like there was much. Now I know it's in the Bible, and I looked it up because of the power of Google. 1732 was the first term of lesbian in England from a book called The Toast. But the Bible to 1732, I mean, God, there must have been some prefaces before the founding of our country. And I'll ask three questions all in one. And the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, endowed by their creator. That included gays and lesbians, right? And then enshrined in the Constitution, we put it right in there. And of course we didn't. Let's put a little bit of a historical background into this instead of just my layman's approach to Wikipedia.
well, I guess this touches on such strange things to talk about, but in a way, you almost have to go back to the tens of thousands of years of prehistory, where human beings were practicing a lot of different ways of being human beings for tens of thousands of years, and the idea that that there would be a preferred gender, defined gender role and ways of achieving sexual climax, that some of these are good and some of them are bad. These things all evolved over thousands of years. And even when you get back to the first recorded history, you're right, we'll go thousands of years and cultures all over the world where these things are more or less negotiated on a person-to-person basis, not on a kind of social basis on a grand scale. We're not even dealing with nations or nation states until pretty late in the human story. So in a sense, all of this stuff is recent history. The idea that there would be a thing called a nuclear family with a father and a mother and children, and that would be the preferred form of family, is something that has been around for a few thousand years, but it's something that evolved out of a security arrangement for the best way of caring for offspring. And then when you get into the Christian religion, even the reading of the Bible was not even emphasized for the first, 1,500 years of the Christian faith. So the a lot of the norms that we think about are really have come around in the last 300 or 400 years. And so the idea that, our Constitution and Declaration of Independence would say something specific about sexual preference or sexual activities, sexual identities would really be, it would be very hard to believe that such a thing would be included. But we will. But the reason it becomes important, and what's important about our Declaration and our Constitution, is that they were both conceived as freedom documents. The idea, the underlying idea of the Declaration and the Constitution is that that you are, and your natural state is a state of freedom. And we're going to institute a government, we're going to use a constitution in order to enact the ideals of the Declaration that will say that as long as you're not hurting somebody else, you're more or less going to be left alone. And one of the most compelling statements on gay rights came from Dick Cheney back in the 1990s. And he simply said, freedom means freedom for everyone. And if you're looking for a guiding principle, just ask yourself, is this something that I would deny to myself? And because the government recognized my marriage, it seemed fair that either the government should stop recognizing marriages or it should recognize the marriages of other people. And so I didn't. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, finish that statement, but then I'm going to interrupt you. You didn't?
Well, so it seemed it seemed like intellectually that was the kind of problem that had to be worked out, at least in the 1990s, when I started thinking about this stuff in a more systematic way.
Okay, so Professor, now I'll interrupt. So you've been fairly consistent since we've known each other. We met at the American Enterprise Institute a few years ago, and you've been consistent. Everybody has an opinion, great, but shouldn't it be an informed opinion? I mean, there's an opinion that is kind of almost meaningless. It's just like some gut instinct thing, and people argue about that all the time on Facebook and other places. But there's actually are facts, and there's things that have happened, and shouldn't you kind of think through things? Mm-hmm. And so I hear you, but we've also gone from, I asked a question of the Declaration of Independence, and you went to the 90s with Dick Cheney. You've made me, well, you haven't made me, but you've requested to your spheres of influence that if you really want to understand racism, for example, you should read some good books, historical books. And so finally, after a year or two of listening to you intently, I've decided to read American Slavery, American Freedom, or maybe it's American Freedom, American Slavery by Edmund, I think it is. And I'm on the sixth chapter. And it is clear to me, though, that the founding of our country isn't necessarily based on freedom. They had all sorts of puritanical rules on our sexual behavior and our engagement, and it was like seemed like England, or at least the company or whatever, was putting these mores onto us. So talk a little bit about the founding of our country,
because it's an important distinction to make. When you use the term puritanical, I want you to remember something very important about specifically the Puritans, which is the Puritans had almost no laws regulating human behavior. All of their laws and what governed themselves in their lives were church laws, churches that they belonged to. And so I remember something John Winthrop said in a letter once, because people wanted to keep making the practices of the church, state law, and John Winthrop kept writing them back saying, no, 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 we don't want any of this stuff to be laws. And so even the use of the term puritanical, the Puritans literally wanted these things governed by the family and by the church, not by the government.
Now, is there a merging? And admittedly, my history is not great. A law degree does not necessarily mean you know history. It means you know a little bit about law. It seemed to me that there was all sorts of punishments, that the church and the state were somewhat intertwined with the power of the king and the colonies. If adultery or sodomy, or it seemed like all of a sudden you might lose your life, or have some huge or horrible, cruel punishment on behalf of the church. So I guess I'm pushing back on your statement that it's family or church, not government. Isn't it one and the same?
Remember that if you were banished from the colony, it was the same as a death sentence. So belonging to your family and belonging to your church was what kept you alive in a very rugged environment. So
aren't I more correct than you are then? It is government.
Well, it's a community. I don't know what it's not it's not the national government, it's not the king, and it's not the colonial charters gave those powers to the colonies themselves, and then the colonies divested those powers to each of the villages and townships. So in a way, I mean, it's democracy in action. I mean, this is local government enforcing local standards. If anything, typically what you would see is the opposite, which is you'd see some local community going too far, and then the central authority would be the one to put an end to it. I mean, if you think about what the Salem witch trials really were, the Salem witch trials were not the central authority hanging witches. That was the central authority saying to a bunch of locals, hey, we think you're lying about all of this, so we're going to put it on trial to prove that this is fake, and so that you will stop it. It was something to stop a local practice, not to encourage a local practice. So if you think about any kind of social issue that is described from the 1600s or 1700s and then ripped out of that context and dropped to its present day context, instead of it, think about it this way. Think about a bunch of cheerleaders bullying each other and the principal coming and saying, stop doing that. That's maybe a little more analogous. It would be, there are always, I mean, our greatest oppressors are often the people who we live with and around. I mean, it's the most effective oppression is normally the stuff that's coming directly to you, not the stuff that's coming 1,000 miles away from you.
Yeah, no doubt. So I'm going to make a bridge now, and I'm not sure I want to go a couple hundred years, but because in 5 or so minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from our friends that have joined us. So these terms are really shocking to me. Hold on, Jason, can you put yourself on mute? Professor, it was the first time a homosexual was defined by all-powerful Wikipedia is in 1869 from Hungary. And then there was bisexual in 1894 in the psychiatric sexualis, whatever that is. And then 1955, gosh, that's barely before I was born, gays were defined, so to speak. And then 1965, a year before I was born, transgender. At least at the founding, can we both agree that it was probably not a good time to be gay or lesbian or transgender or some version of from the founding of our country and before to up into the 50s? It was probably not a good time to be socially accepted in your community.
Yes, but it's never a good time to be a member of a unpopular or somebody who's whose normal life is different than the other 97% of the population. But you're right. What we see is in the 19th century, that's when science and anthropology are starting to put labels and categories on human beings. And so that's why we see that kind of thing. And then, the area of psychology is coming around late 19th, early 20th century. So that's when they're trying to figure out, how the brain works and brain function, and that involves putting labels on things. And then for the most part, what was officially, we see things like the government, the national government taking a stand on behaviors in things like during wartime. So in World War II, if you talk to any World War II veterans, they'll tell you that officially you could not be gay in the military, but unofficially there were gays in the military, and that it was only if their behavior became public or problematic, or if it became a crisis, or some way or another, if something became public, then yes, they would get kicked out of the military for being gay. But when you talk to veterans of World War II in the interviews, they'll tell you, well, these guys got kicked out. I remember this incident, but these guys didn't. And it's always good to remember that in human interactions, you will always have friendships, and you will always have people who will, keep your secrets for you. And of course, it's always interesting to look back at some of the notable instances of gay people playing an important role in American history. Many of the early spies, people who worked at the CIA, were gay. And one of my favorite stories was about the journalist Joseph Alsop. I don't know if you know who that is, but he and his brother were two of the most influential journalists really in American history. They were cousins of the Roosevelts. So they were cousins of both Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, which gave them tremendous access in Washington, D.C. And so much so that, he was with John Kennedy when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. He was close enough to Allen Dulles that Allen Dulles would pull him in the 1950s once a week. He would get to look at all the classified information that the CIA had access to. And he was gay, and everybody knew he was gay. And Dwight Eisenhower knew he was gay, and Allen Dulles knew he was gay. So much so that the KGB actually tried to frame him. They set him up in Moscow with a young man and filmed it. But Joe Alsop was such a patriot that when they tried to blackmail him, he took the material directly over to the FBI and the CIA and said, "Look, they're trying to blackmail me because I'm gay." And he said, "Well, everybody already knows," and they just said, "Well, if it ever comes out, we'll deal with it then. But we all know you're gay, Joe." But he wouldn't allow himself to be compromised by the KGB. And I always thought of that as kind of one of the ultimate examples of patriotism of any American, because it would have ruined certainly his career as a journalist if he had ever been outed. This was in the incident was in the late 40s, early 50s. I think it was the late 40s was when they tried to do this to him.
How's your memory? Wasn't there a president that was supposedly gay, or at least had a male companion for 13 years that everyone just kind of assumed they were gay? And I didn't write down the president's name, unfortunately, but does that ring a bell?
Well, it's a funny thing. Like when you start getting into issues of people's private lives and sexuality, I don't know I'm not comfortable putting a label on anyone that they aren't comfortable putting on themselves. So he never said he was, and maybe they were just friends, and like I don't know, like it sometimes I think about this sometimes, but like I have close friends. And if any of you are involved in especially with my friends who are really deeply religious, the way you describe your love relationships with your especially Christian friends, it 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 can seem almost romantic, or would certainly read as romantic if you were trying. But
And I don't mean to be disrespectful to your religious analogy, but the same thing happens at a bar. I mean,
yeah,
when you're really, or a hunting trip, or I mean, it's just the same thing.
yeah, and so um, I, my line has always just been to take people as they are and as they were, and whatever the evidence says, let's call it evidence. But I don't like putting a label on something without direct evidence.
So there, let's jump up to the modern era, and then we'll open it up to our friends. There have been real life ramifications, though. Yes, my father served on a naval aircraft carrier in the Korean War, the USS Philippine Sea. And in addition to your point about gays, which he verified, I remember talking to him about that before he died. More important was venereal diseases and what happens when you have that on ship, but unrelated to gays. The If you were gay in the military, that was not a good time. I mean, it was against the law. You could be court-martialed, and then don't ask, don't tell, and then the Defense of Marriage Act. I mean, there was a lot of stuff in our modern lifetimes that was not very pleasant. Amendment, I think Amendment 2, was it in Colorado? We became the hate state over it. So how did it happen so quickly? At least that's my premise. Thousands of years. And then in the last 25-ish, 30 years, it seems like it has completely changed around, where most people, not all, but probably a majority, seem to be not only supportive or tolerant, but an advocate of being who you are. Agree or disagree? Where are we right now, and how did it happen so rapidly, if you believe it happened rapidly?
Well, I believe that it happened publicly very rapidly, and probably the success of the movement came from the fact that so many people. I mean, when you have a population that is, let's say, about 3% of the population is gay, and then when you sort of put people who have other forms of sexuality that are let's I mean, maybe say like more fluid, you add them on to the top of that 3%, and you're talking about 1 in 15 or 1 in 20 people that you know in your regular life that feel like that have some form of sexuality that was publicly condemned. And that means that that every member of your every member of your family has every family has family members who are gay. And so in a way, it was something that we were all dealing with in our personal lives, that just had to be sort of exposed to the light of day. And so what it really took was courage. I was, when you mentioned military veterans, I remember at one of the Republican meetings a few years ago, they were doing a thing specifically about veterans, and it was like, oh, now veterans stand up and that sort of thing. And it was all the log cabin guys who were all the veterans because they were all Vietnam and Korea era veterans that were the people who were advocating for gay rights. But now that fewer people serve in the military, it's sort of interesting that that the log cabin had the largest number of veterans in it, in this room I was in. So what it really took was people having what was a part of their private life, and something that a lot of families had already negotiated with, and having that become public. And I'll say this: one of the things I was most wrong about is, and there weren't horrible consequences for this, but if you, as a historian, I think one of the things that I got wrong early on was the role that coming out would have, because I had previously sort of not understood the significance, or the public significance of people who are coming out, because it was so incredibly difficult for those people early on. but what that did is it made people acknowledge reality. The reality that these people are your brothers and sisters and cousins and and that they're members of your family, and that once you realize that that it's not just your family's story, but it's every family's story. It does mean, well, this is something that we really have to deal with. It's not going away. The number of gay people has been steady for, it's steady, pretty steady across cultures, across time periods. Like there, it's just, there are areas of sexuality that are much more fluid, and those numbers will change via culture and stuff like that. But in terms of the number of people who are attracted to people of the same sex, it's been a pretty constant number. So I would just say it's sort of like saying, why did we acknowledge that the sun rises in the morning? Because we have to. The sun is going to come up in the morning. Like, 1 to 3% of the population of the world is gay, and the world is a better place if we just sort of acknowledge that and deal with it as reality. We should face reality on reality's terms. Otherwise, you're going to be one of those people who just denies that the sun comes up in the morning.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, I have a bunch of comments on that, but it's already 11:38 in Colorado, 10:38 in California, where you're at. I do want to open it up to questions, and if there's not some questions, then I'll ask mine. So, friends, this is the time for you to jump in. I know some of you have already typed something off to the right, but I'd rather use your own words with your own style, so you can either read it or you can change it a little bit as to your preference. So Susan or Erica or Jason.
I'm going to
Jason,
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say I'm going to go quick because I know I sound terrible. It feels to me like the federal style large governments really only started interfering in who we have sex with in like the 1500s. And we're just, in the course of human history, we're not that far from that. So to me, it doesn't feel like a fast change. It feels like we probably shouldn't have been involved in that in the first place. Let's go back to pre-1500s where people have sex with who you want to have sex with. Does that feel consistent with your research, Dr. Tootle?
Thanks, Erica.
Well, I guess I should emphasize that, again, I've never done primary source research in this area, so I'm not an expert in the history of the LGBT movement. But that being said, you're basically right. And the difference is that we've always had legal institutions that were tied to heterosexuality. And so the question for us, how do we manage this, is how do you manage legal institutions that are designed around the a heterosexual relationship? Do you and so most of the controversy came with, in a way, the purely libertarian answer wasn't good enough, because the purely libertarian answer would have been to simply do away with every legal institution that surrounds heterosexual marriage. And so that's more or less what had to be worked out in the legal process. Now, most of the issues that have to be worked out surround, in a way, it feels very much like the civil rights kind of cases that have to get worked out. We have a Klan member who owns a business. What is the obligation of that Klan member to serve Black people who come into his business? That kind of thing. What can you force that Klan member to do? What counts as his religious freedom? What counts as his political freedom? That kind of stuff. But the nice thing I'd say is that we already have a pretty robust body of law that works out these public accommodation questions. And usually it's the inconsistency of those laws and how they're applied that find their way spinning up to the Supreme Court. But yesterday was the 6-year anniversary of Lagerfeld, right? So we're going on 6 years, and I'm more surprised. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but how once that domino fell, that the issues fell in pretty neatly into this larger body of law over the past 6 years, and we haven't seen more challenges to it, really.
It's been almost remarkable though that the society just went okay, but we were arguing about it for decades, recent decades. I didn't know about centuries, Erica, but in recent decades it seemed like this was just a horrible battles, and then all of a sudden, oh, okay.
Yeah, the turning point really. I mean, to give the more recent history, but no, the the AIDS crisis really pushed a lot of this to the forefront as a public health issue, that we had to acknowledge the existence of gay people. and But then in the early Clinton administration, gays in the military was a huge political issue. Um, and then also in the Clinton administration, the Defense of Marriage Act.
But Professor, but it was 31 states that banned that. I mean, it was the momentum was all on the other side, and then within just a few years, it just completely flips again, based off a Supreme Court decision.
Yes, but when we see trends like that, it's almost the last gasp. I mean, one of the things about our political system is that for every action by one party, there will be the overreaction of the other. And so what we saw was the vast majority of Americans moving in a certain direction, and then the last attempt to use that fear for electoral purposes. But I remember, some of the same politicians, behind closed doors, like none of them cared about gay marriage. Like they would pretend to. I mean, they were just being completely disingenuous. In the 1990s and 2000s, it was something that they knew they could fundraise off of, and something that they knew was making their constituents excited. But
then they went back to their real life and their family, that they either had somebody from college or a family member who was gay, and they were human on that in a personal way, but in a political way, they pandered.
And so what really happened was, after the Supreme Court decision, they could all come out with their non-opposition. They didn't have to pretend they opposed gay rights anymore. Right. So they could make the argument, well, it's already been decided by the Supreme Court, so, I mean, they were all, it was a time, I remember, when I was disappointed with the lack of political leadership, because so many people were saying that kind of thing behind closed doors. And they would always say, because I was always the person, kind of pushing them behind closed doors. And you'd get their response. They're like, listen, my best friend is gay. The chief of staff is gay, and they'd say, like, I don't have a problem with gay people. Like, I can't, I'll lose my next election if I do this, or I'll lose my primary, and you'd say, okay, well, maybe you wouldn't. How about a little courage, but
yeah. And Professor, here's another mea culpa, or an understanding of politics. I was generally amenable to civil unions and even gay marriage before any Republicans were, but I wasn't about ready to do it when the president of the United States, Barack Obama, wasn't. So a conservative Republican is going to be in favor of that when a liberal Democrat is not? No, thank you. But as soon as he changed his mind, cool, then I can move along without too much umbrage. And so I don't mean to take a historical context into real world politics, but
yeah, I mean, I guess I was really unique in this regard, because I was always a conservative Republican, and I was in grad school, and I'd always worked for. I'd never taken a public position against gay marriage or gay rights, and I had never really thought about the issue of gay marriage that much until the mid 1990s. And the first time I I kind of encountered the issue in a serious intellectual way was it was in the fall of 1998. And that's when Andrew Sullivan, I don't know if any of you remember Andrew Sullivan, but he was writing for the New Republic, and then he started his own blog. And one of the things that was interesting is he was gay and he was a conservative Republican and writing for a liberal magazine. And in the early days of blogging, I would write to him and he would write back. And so in long, serious, thoughtful exchanges with him about the nature of gay, what it meant to think about gay rights in a legal context. And I was very lucky. I don't even know if he would remember this, but because at the time I was just a first year grad student, but I wasn't approaching it from a position of opposition, just from a position of I don't know, how's this going to work, and I really worked my way through most of those legal, political, and philosophical issues through a series of long emails with Andrew Sullivan in 1998. And so I've always supported gay marriage for as long as I have, from the time that anybody has ever asked me my opinion about it. And I have always supported gay rights and gay marriage, not in spite of being a conservative, but because I'm a conservative. I've never made a liberal case for gay rights. I've always made a conservative case for the rights of all Americans. So I never saw any conflict at all between conservatism and, I mean, at the heart of American conservatism is the protection of all rights. And like I know I've repeated this line from Dick Cheney, but freedom means freedom for everybody, and you just apply that principle insofar as it is practicable, and that means freedom for the person who hates gay people and freedom for the gay person. And if we're making some sort of public accommodation because of someone's heterosexuality, then we should make that same accommodation available to someone who has the same sex attraction. Or we should just not have that accommodation. Maybe that's what society is evolving to, but don't make it on the basis of favoring one group of people over another. I don't believe in special rights for anybody, but I believe in equal rights for everybody.
Great. Jason, I think you had a question before somebody else jumped in. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. Like you've said before, Professor Tootle, this is some of these major changes have happened so recently. It's hard to have a historical viewpoint on some of these things because it's not history yet, quote unquote. But in terms of the current conservative party in politics, there seems to be more than one issue that could cause a fissure within the political party. And I wonder if historically there's any comparisons you can make, because the people that are hanging on to this, that were even just a few days ago talking to the Joint Chiefs of Staff about a woke military, and that's code for what we're talking about here, I think. And there's the voting thing, which is anti civil rights, if you look at it a certain way, because the right to vote is very important since the Voting Rights Act 65. And then there's abortion, and this the conservative party in American politics right now seems to have so many of these fissure lines. How can it remain united over time here, or is this a party that's in trouble? Because the evangelical, 30% of this party does a lot different than what I'm hearing the conservative thinkers in this discussion talk about. That's not how they're talking.
Yeah, got your question, Jason. Professor.
Well, I'd say that the Republican Party needs to rediscover its own ideology. The problem with the Republican Party is that there are people within it who are reactionaries, who believe that you should appoint justices to the Supreme Court on the basis of what you think how they will decide a case, instead of, appointing justices to the Supreme Court who will just interpret the law and put the Constitution into practice. Or to put it another way, my preference would always be, and I think that every party is in trouble if they don't have an ideological basis for their party, because you can have hate burns out pretty quickly, and you can get people pretty excited and hated up for a short amount of time, but that hate, it just can't sustain a political movement. You have to have some ideas. And so I don't see a traditional conservative understanding of rights as being opposed to conservatism. And I would just say that like you can be a conservative and be opposed to a lot of the wokeness stuff, as I would say I am, on precisely the same basis that I support gay rights, which is I don't believe that anybody should be shoving their beliefs on me, and that would include people who hate gay people and people who think that they're an ally or something. Like the thing that should be tying us together is a commitment to freedom and rule of law. And that puts us in opposition to, I guess I would say, the people motivated by hatred in both parties.
Follow-up question, Jason, or is that good?
Thank you.
Okay, great. Susan or Bart or Jake? Susan, just unmute yourself.
Hit the space bar. Hold the space bar. down.
Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Well, good morning, everybody. Mine isn't so much a question or may become a question, but I think where maybe this conversation is, and I came in late to it, so I didn't get all of the history. Buchanan is the president you were thinking of, John, just by the way.
I still like Professor Tootle's answer, though, if it's none of our business, since he didn't make it. But yes, it was Buchanan.
Right. Yeah, no, I asked my husband, and he's the history buff in the family. So I think some of what's missing is focusing on the sexual aspect of LGBTQ as opposed to the gender identity aspect of it, which is what LGBTQ people identify themselves as. And it's less important who they sleep with as what identity they have and what biases they face in the workplace and in society as people of color face and people with different abilities face. So I think that's really, I mean, if we're going to talk about equity and equality, then I think we need to talk and focus less on whether, the religious people are kind of caught up in the who shall lie down with who, as opposed to these people identifying as being different than those of us who identify as heterosexual female or heterosexual male.
We're almost out of time. So, Professor, is it time and love who you love, or is it who you touch and sexuality, or both? Do you have a response to Susan?
Well, I guess there is a role. We each one of us has an identity, and we all have an ego, and we have some concept of who we are and a preference for how we would like to be treated. But all of those things, the same principle that I guess my only caution is that the same principle that says that you get to have your identity and decide it for yourself means that I get to have my identity and I get to decide it for myself too. You know, and you know, we've in an earlier episode talked about how I don't really like it when other people call me white, because that's not an identity that I put on myself. And even like, I understand that other people would call me straight, you know, and male, right? But I would just say, like, yes, if you must know, if I must reveal that who I am attracted to, yes, I am attracted to women, you know. But like, I don't want that to be a part of who I am, or, you know, it's something that it's none of your business. So the idea, but so I want to be careful when we get into issues of identity, because I don't have to accept your identity. Part of my identity can be that I don't accept yours, and we need to preserve freedom on both sides of that transaction. Because part of my identity might be that you show up wearing a rainbow afro wig, and you might not want me to say, what's with the rainbow afro wig? And I might say, what's with the rainbow afro wig? And you could say, oh, I'm now offended because this rainbow afro wig is part of my identity. And there is no right to not be offended. That's not a right. The right stands with the person who wants to be offended. Our system is designed to protect people who have unpopular beliefs. You don't have to protect people who have popular beliefs. You don't have to protect the right of somebody to like Nike shoes. You have to protect the right of somebody who has an unpopular viewpoint. So my I don't even know if I'd say it's my bias, but my recognition of the system we live in, and that produces the most prosperity and peace, and allows for people of different lifestyles to flourish, is a system that protects the rights of unpopular minorities, whoever those unpopular minorities are. And that includes rich people, and it includes gay people.
Susan,
Well,
do you have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, absolutely. The whole concept of gender identity isn't we will debate whether it's a decision or not. Someone who states that they are a transgender female, they didn't decide that. They know in themselves that that's who they are. So it wasn't a decision, it's who they are. And that's very different than what you said.
Well, I would
Response, Professor?
Well, I don't know that I ever gave a definition of transgender that implied that.
You said it was a decision.
I think that how we choose, we can choose. We are, or adults have a frontal lobe. It's the defining feature of being human, that we are able to think critically about ourselves. And so how an individual adult chooses to think about themselves is something that involves their conscious choice. It is, I'm not saying that you would.
Not a choice.
Okay.
That will be we will just have to agree to disagree on this one. It's not a choice. It's who they are.
I'm not saying that it's that there aren't you know, things that are innate within us, but no matter who you are, and no matter what your the things you are born with, the inclinations, or however you want to put your biological whatever it is that's stamped upon your biology, there is still a part of you that is an individual. There is still a part of you that is responsible for your own autonomy and actions. And I'm not saying that somebody chooses to be gay. I'm not saying somebody chooses to be transgender, but I'm saying that who you are as a person and how you choose, you are an individual. You have autonomy. you are capable of thinking about your own life. That is the defining feature of being human, is your ability to think about the meaning of your own life. And however you think about your own life is a choice.
And Professor, my instinct says, listening to you both, it's a semantic miscommunication that you may actually not be in disagreement, Susan, but it's a worthwhile topic. If you'll both think about that, and let's discuss that in future, since you're both friends, and we can stay in touch with each other. Or Susan, you're a longtime listener, a regular caller, so thank you. Bart or Jake, any quick question and comment? And a quick reaction, Professor. We're almost out of time. Bart.
I'm good. I don't have any questions. This is a fascinating conversation.
Thanks for joining us. Jake.
Yeah, so kind of going more on like the political legal thread that you would be an expert to be able to speak on. What's your opinion on the majority ruling with Bostock versus Clayton County? Because that was the 2020 case that said that Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act applied to people now. You can't discriminate on against people based on the sexual orientation.
I don't know. I think the Supreme Court is generally correct. And the majority decision was generally correct. But I think there were things in the dissents and in the concurrences that pointed out that this is an area that still needs to be worked. There are some areas around the margins that still need to be worked out. So I would just say that the majority opinion was generally correct. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some weaknesses that need to be worked out. Especially, it's definitely not going to be the final word. I'm going to punt and just say it's not the final word.
But Jake, I'm going to give you a chance to make your advocacy if you have a point that you'd like us all to consider on that topic.
Well, yeah, so I'm in favor of the majority opinion. Like, I don't think that you should be able to discriminate against someone when it comes to employment based off of, sexual identity or orientation, however you want to define it. But I did like what got brought up in the dissenting opinions about how, yes, this is an issue. We don't want to discriminate against people. However, we don't think that the law applies to them in this case. We feel, like Alito and Clarence Thomas said, we don't think that the act as it was originally designed is supposed to apply to people based off of sexual orientation. It was mostly based around race and sex. And so if you want to solve this issue, you should just pass another piece of legislation that says this is the Civil Rights Act of 2021. You cannot discriminate against people based off of sexual orientation. So that's what they were saying. And the dissent,
it was an interesting decision in this regard because it involved a little bit of trickery, which was John Roberts said, basically like you have to imagine a scenario where a man would bring a man to like a picnic and then you would say you are discriminating against this person because you're aware of their sexuality. And it was like almost like a backdoor way of saying that the text said that discrimination against somebody for being homosexual is implied in gender discrimination. So it was at least a defensible. I think what Jake is saying is, and this is, it wasn't the dissent wasn't completely outrageous because the plain text of it was not intended to be to apply to gay people, but a plain reading of so it's like an originalist versus a textualist split.
Sure.
So in the case, the textualists sided with the liberals and the originalists opposed. So that's why you ended up with that 5-4 decision. And I would simply say I would have probably decided the case on a slightly different basis. That would have been I would have disagreed with all 9 of them, I guess. But I would have been on the side of the 5 in the case.
Well, and there are many of us that would prefer that the legislature legislate and the judicial interpret the legislation, and that's all they do. So that's a similar
in case from a textual standpoint, because you read, Robert's opinion, and it's like, well, this does make sense. There's no way to conceive of gender that wouldn't reveal that a discrimination between somebody who was gay and somebody who was straight, and because of that, the plain text should apply to gender. Like it was just so novel. I had never that had never occurred to me as a legal argument before that case.
Professor, with your permission, we've gone over time, and so I'd like to wrap this up. I thought this was an important conversation for several different reasons. One is to maximize human freedom, and 2, protect if their rights are protected, then mine will be protected even in a greater way, perhaps. But I also think it's important to engage in political conversation in a respectful, civil tone, because so much of the world seems to just throw out vitriol, and then you throw out some more in return, and somehow think that's helping society when people just throw out bombs at each other. And so I like having hot topics or controversial topics in a civil tone that you're so good at. That's my conclusion of why this is an important topic, those 2, both substance and process. Do you have a wrap up that you'd like to conclude with? Questions I didn't ask, or texts or books that you'd refer us to, or things to ponder in the future?
Well, I guess the writings that were most influential for me were probably the arguments of people like Andrew Sullivan and George Will, and I'm trying to remember who else was really, people like Jonah Goldberg, who's at AEI now. A lot of the standard writers that that we're all kind of familiar with. Maybe some old names from the 90s, people like Charles Krauthammer we're all wrestling with this issue. And so there was a rich, in an interesting way, when you wanted to know about slavery, that book I recommended, American Slavery, American Freedom, came out in 1974. So there isn't a sort of classic in this field yet. But the classics in this field are probably being written right now, and they're going to be written in the next 10 years. So hopefully in 10 or 20 years, I'll be able to do a webcast like this and recommend some amazing books for you.
Awesome. Well, Professor, thank you for your time. Team, next week, I'm hoping the professor is going to agree, since we're coming up on the 4th of July or Independence Day, a conversation on what patriotism means and what nationalism occasionally infused into patriotism, how that's probably contrary, but I don't want to. And then, American exceptionalism. And does that mean we're better? And if so, what ways? So I'm kind of thinking a patriotic conversation and what a good citizen should be thinking about over the 4th of July. So I don't know if I'm sorry to put pressure on you, but that's what I'd like to do, Professor. And then there's going to be an interesting, I don't think debate's necessarily the right word, but a prominent historian from Howard University, who is probably on the more liberal tradition, is going to have a discussion with Professor Tootle about critical race theory and the 1619 Project and where we are in race and racism today. And I'm hoping it's not going to be a debate, because that's contrary to what I'm generally interested in. I'm more interested in forming bridges and where we agree on, and then distinguishing between what we disagree on. But I hope you'll all tune in on that. Professor, is there any other hot topics that you're interested in talking about in future weeks, or those seem rational?
Those all seem great to me. Although, I'll just say, if it was a debate between me and that guy, I would lose. He's you rounded up a pretty good expert. So
he's a pretty good expert.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot more of me deferring to him than a debate, I have a feeling.
Well, that will be nice and gracious, but I wanted to undersell yourself. But yes, I think he's a pretty good expert. Yeah, so this will be fun for for all of us. And then we're also going to have a discussion on abortion. I see someone typed in a comment on that. We're going to do that in 3 or 4 weeks from now. So team, thanks so much for joining us. If you'd like to say hi for just 2 or 3 more minutes afterwards, after I stop the video, you're welcome not to hang up yet. Otherwise, hope to see you next Friday at 11 o'clock Mountain or 10 o'clock Central. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Good job, Professor.